The corridor outside the maternity ward smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh flowers, a strange mix of sterility and fragile hope. Nurses moved quietly, their shoes whispering against the polished floor, while new fathers paced with phones in their hands, rehearsing messages they would soon send to waiting relatives. In the middle of all this, a tense confrontation unfolded, sharp enough to cut through the calm like broken glass. The mother-in-law stood rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes blazing with a certainty that left no room for compromise. She pointed toward the exit as if it were a courtroom verdict, her voice low but venomous, telling her daughter-in-law that she had no place there, that she should leave immediately. The young woman, pale and exhausted after childbirth, clutched the edge of the hospital bed. Her body ached, but it was the words that hurt most. She had imagined this moment differently, a family united by the arrival of a child, smiles instead of accusations, warmth instead of cold authority. Instead, she felt like an intruder in her own story, reduced to a problem that needed to be removed. The mother-in-law spoke of tradition, of respect, of how things had always been done, insisting that the baby belonged to her family and her rules. Each sentence landed heavier than the last, until the room itself seemed to shrink. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances but hesitated to intervene. Family conflicts were not uncommon here, and experience had taught them that stepping in too soon could make things worse. The daughter-in-law's husband was nowhere to be seen, delayed by paperwork and phone calls, unaware that the emotional battle had already begun. The mother-in-law took his absence as permission, leaning closer, her shadow stretching across the white sheets like a warning. Then, just as the words, "Pack your things," left her mouth, the door opened. The unexpected guest did not raise his voice or make a dramatic entrance. He simply stepped inside, calm and composed, his presence immediately changing the air in the room. It was the hospital administrator, accompanied by a senior doctor who had overseen the delivery. Their expressions were professional, but their eyes missed nothing. The administrator asked, politely but firmly, if there was a problem. The mother-in-law froze, her authority suddenly questioned, her certainty faltering. The doctor reminded her that the patient's well-being came first, that stress was dangerous after childbirth, and that no one had the right to remove a mother from her own child. For the first time, the mother-in-law had no answer. Her mouth opened, then closed again. The room fell silent except for the soft breathing of the newborn. The daughter-in-law felt tears spill down her cheeks, not from fear this time, but from relief. Someone had finally drawn a line she could not cross. That same sense of tension, of power shifting unexpectedly, played out on a very different stage thousands of miles away, under bright studio lights instead of hospital fluorescence. On a morning television set, what was supposed to be a routine interview began to unravel in real time. The host smiled, the cameras rolled, and Tom Cruise sat poised, relaxed, and ready to talk about his latest project. The conversation flowed easily at first, anecdotes and promotional sound bites exchanged like practiced steps in a familiar dance. But then the questions changed. Michael Strahan leaned forward, his tone sharpening as he pressed into more personal territory, framing his curiosity as journalistic persistence. He spoke about dedication, about public perception, about controversies that had followed Cruise for years. There was an assumption in the air that the guest would deflect politely, offer a rehearsed response, and move on. Morning television thrived on that balance, just enough edge to feel real, never enough to disrupt the show. Cruise did not play along. He listened, eyes steady, a faint smile lingering for a moment longer than expected. When he responded, his voice was calm, measured, but unmistakably firm. He spoke about boundaries, about respect, about the difference between meaningful questions and provocation for its own sake. He made it clear that he was there to talk about his work, not to be cornered into defending his life choices on a format designed for sound bites. The studio grew quiet in the way only live television can. Crew members shifted behind the cameras, aware that something unscripted was unfolding. Strahan tried to redirect, to regain control, but Cruise held his ground. He did not raise his voice or insult the host. Instead, he shut the line of questioning down by refusing to engage on its terms, reclaiming the narrative with composure rather than confrontation. Viewers watching at home felt the shift instantly. Social media lit up with reactions, some praising Cruise for standing up for himself, others debating whether the questions had crossed a line. What everyone agreed on was that the moment felt real. It was not a rehearsed clash or a manufactured controversy, it was a clear example of someone deciding, in real time, that enough was enough. Back in the maternity ward, the husband finally arrived, breathless and confused, only to find his mother silent and the staff firmly in control of the situation. The administrator explained what had happened, making it clear that any further disturbances would not be tolerated. The husband turned to his wife, saw the exhaustion and relief mingled on her face, and understood without words where his loyalty needed to lie. The mother-in-law, confronted by both authority and the consequences of her actions, retreated, her power diminished not by shouting, but by boundaries. Both moments, though worlds apart, shared a common truth. Whether in a hospital room or a television studio, power often reveals itself not through volume or aggression, but through calm refusal to be pushed beyond what is right. The daughter-in-law did not win by arguing, she was protected when someone with the authority to intervene chose to act. Tom Cruise did not dominate the interview by force, he did so by asserting control over his own narrative. In each case, the unexpected guest or response served as a mirror, reflecting behavior back to those who assumed they could dominate without consequence. The mother-in-law was left speechless, forced to confront the limits of her control. The interviewer was reminded, live on air, that even celebrities have lines that should not be crossed. By the end of the day, the maternity ward returned to its gentle rhythm, and the television show moved on to its next segment. Yet the echoes of those moments lingered, resonating with anyone who had ever felt cornered, dismissed, or silenced. They were reminders that dignity does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, changes the atmosphere, and leaves those who overstepped struggling to find their words. The maternity ward was unusually tense for a place meant to welcome new life. Behind the thin curtain separating beds, a newborn whimpered softly, unaware of the emotional storm gathering just a few steps away. The young mother lay still, her body weak from labor, her heart heavy from words that should never have been spoken in such a moment. Standing at the foot of the bed, her mother-in-law spoke with sharp certainty, as if she were delivering a command rather than addressing a woman who had just given birth. She insisted that the daughter-in-law had no right to stay, that family honor, customs, and control mattered more than comfort or compassion. Every sentence carried the weight of years of unchallenged authority. The daughter-in-law tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Her hands trembled as she pulled the blanket closer, not for warmth, but for protection. She had entered this family believing love would eventually soften resistance, that patience would earn respect. Instead, she now faced rejection at her most vulnerable moment. The mother-in-law's words cut deeply, suggesting that the baby belonged more to the family name than to the woman who had carried it for 9 months. The room felt smaller with each passing second, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Nurses lingered near the doorway, trained to provide care but wary of stepping into family conflicts. They could sense the imbalance of power, the way one voice dominated while another was silenced. The absence of the husband made the situation worse. Without him, the mother-in-law felt emboldened, convinced that no one would challenge her authority. She spoke of decisions already made, of arrangements planned without consultation, of a future in which the daughter-in-law's role would be strictly defined and tightly controlled. Just as the pressure became unbearable, the door opened. The interruption was so sudden that it felt almost unreal. A senior doctor entered first, followed by the hospital's patient relations officer. Their presence immediately shifted the dynamic. They did not shout or accuse, they simply asked what was happening and listened carefully to the response. The mother-in-law attempted to justify herself, framing her demands as concern and tradition, but her words sounded hollow in the face of professional scrutiny. The doctor explained, with quiet authority, that emotional distress could seriously harm a new mother's recovery and that hospital policy protected patients from any form of coercion or harassment. Silence followed. The mother-in-law, so confident moments earlier, now struggled to maintain her composure. The patient relations officer reminded her that this was not a private household but a medical facility, and that the mother had every right to be there with her child. If those rights were not respected, security would be involved. The implication was clear. Power had shifted, not through confrontation, but through clear boundaries backed by authority. The daughter-in-law felt a wave of relief wash over her, mixed with exhaustion and disbelief. Someone had finally seen her, heard her, and acted. That same pattern of tension and sudden reversal played out later that week on a brightly lit television set, where millions watched a seemingly ordinary morning show interview transform into something far more revealing. Tom Cruise sat across from Michael Strahan, relaxed and attentive, prepared to discuss his latest film. The atmosphere was friendly at first, filled with laughter and polished exchanges designed to keep viewers entertained. Cruise, a seasoned veteran of media appearances, navigated the early questions with ease. Then the tone shifted. Strahan's questions became more pointed, drifting away from the film and into personal territory that Cruise had long learned to handle carefully. The host pressed on issues that blurred the line between professional curiosity and personal intrusion. There was an expectation, perhaps, that Cruise would respond with practiced diplomacy, offering vague answers that would satisfy curiosity without stirring controversy. Morning television often relied on that unspoken agreement between host and guest. But Cruise chose a different path. He paused, considering his words, and when he spoke, his response was calm but unmistakably firm. He addressed the question directly, not by answering it, but by challenging its premise. He spoke about respect, about the importance of focusing on the work rather than personal speculation, and about setting limits even in public spaces. His tone remained composed, yet there was no mistaking the message. This line of questioning would go no further. The studio atmosphere changed instantly. Strahan, momentarily caught off guard, attempted to steer the conversation back, but the balance had already shifted. Cruise maintained control, redirecting the discussion to safer ground without apology. There was no dramatic walk-off, no raised voices, just a clear assertion of boundaries on live television. For viewers, the moment felt raw and authentic, a rare glimpse of unscripted tension breaking through the polished surface of a morning show. Social media reactions poured in within minutes. Some applauded Cruise for standing his ground, seeing his response as a reminder that celebrities are not obligated to expose every aspect of their lives. Others debated whether Strahan's questions were fair, arguing that public figures invite scrutiny. Regardless of opinion, the moment sparked conversation, precisely because it challenged assumptions about access, entitlement, and respect. Back in the hospital, the husband finally arrived, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he took in the scene. The staff explained what had occurred, and the reality of the situation settled heavily on him. He turned to his wife, seeing her vulnerability and strength intertwined, and realized that silence would only enable further harm. He spoke to his mother firmly, making it clear that her behavior was unacceptable and that his wife and child came first. The mother-in-law, confronted not only by hospital authority but by her son's resolve, had little choice but to step back. In both stories, the outcome was shaped by a refusal to accept misplaced power. The daughter-in-law did not need to shout or argue. Protection came when systems designed to ensure safety were activated. Tom Cruise did not need to escalate the confrontation. His composure and clarity were enough to halt an uncomfortable line of questioning. In each case, the supposed authority figure, the domineering mother-in-law, the confident television host, was forced to recognize limits they had assumed did not exist. These moments resonated because they reflected experiences many people know too well. Being spoken over, dismissed, or pressured in situations where vulnerability is high is painfully common. What made these stories stand out was not drama for its own sake, but the way dignity was reclaimed. It arrived through calm intervention, through the assertion of rights, and through the courage to say no, even when doing so felt risky. By the time the maternity ward returned to its quiet routine and the television show moved on to lighter segments, the immediate tension had passed. Yet the significance of what happened lingered. They served as reminders that respect is not granted by status alone, and that true authority lies in knowing when to draw a line. Whether in the private space of a hospital room or the public glare of a studio, those lines matter. When they are finally enforced, even the loudest voices can be rendered silent, left searching for words they once wielded so freely.